The snow came down in thick, silent waves, blurring the world into white. Amelia Bennett gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned pale, but it didn't steady the tremor in her hands. The windshield wipers struggled to keep up with the storm, smearing flakes instead of clearing them. The road ahead was a dim gray ribbon that twisted through the Wyoming wilderness. Miles from the life she had just left behind, her phone. Tossed on the passenger seat, blinked with missed calls her mother, her bridesmaid, and most heartbreakingly, her ex-fiancé Matthew. She couldn't bear to look. The memory of what she'd seen only hours ago replayed again and again. The hotel suite where she'd planned to get ready for her wedding. The sound of laughter behind the door, and then the image that had shattered everything. Matthew in bed with her best friend. Lila. The betrayal had cut so deep she could barely breathe. She'd driven without a plan. Without even packing a bag, just fleeing west until the city lights vanished behind her. Now, lost in a snowstorm, she wondered if heartbreak had a physical form because her chest ached with every breath. And the world outside mirrored the emptiness inside her. The car jolted suddenly, tires skidding on black ice. Amelia gasped, jerking the wheel, but the vehicle fishtailed out of control. Time slowed as she saw the headlights twist sideways, then darkness swallowed everything. The car slammed into a snowbank with a dull thud. Her head hit the steering wheel, dazing her. For a moment, there was only the sound of wind howling through the trees. When she lifted her face, the engine had died. The temperature inside dropped quickly, her breath fogging the air. Panic rose in her throat. She reached for her phone, only to find the screen black battery dead. No, 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 she whispered, banging it against her palm. It was useless. She tried the ignition, but the car refused to start. Outside, the storm raged on, relentless. She couldn't even tell which direction she'd come from. The nearest town was at least 20 miles back, maybe more. Tears welled in her eyes, freezing on her lashes before they could fall. For a moment, Amelia considered just closing her eyes, letting the cold numb everything. Maybe it would be easier that way. But somewhere deep inside, a small, stubborn spark refused to die. She'd been betrayed, broken, but she wasn't ready to disappear into the snow. Pulling her coat tighter, she forced the door open and stumbled out. The wind hit her like knives. She shielded her face with one arm and looked around, squinting through the blizzard. That was when she saw it, a faint, flickering light in the distance. It wavered through the trees like a single star fighting the storm. A cabin, maybe? Hope surged through her, fragile but alive. She started walking, boots crunching in deep snow, each step heavier than the last. The cold seeped through her jeans, her gloves, her very bones. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. She slipped more than once, falling to her knees, breath coming in ragged gasps. "Just a little more," she whispered, dragging herself forward. Her limbs were going numb when she finally reached a wooden fence and followed it to a small ranch house. The porch light burned warmly against the dark. She climbed the steps and pounded on the door with what little strength she had left. No one answered at first. Her vision blurred. Then the door opened slowly, revealing a tall, broad-shouldered man framed by golden lamplight. His eyes were deep and unreadable beneath the brim of his hat. Before she could speak, her knees gave out. Strong arms caught her just before she hit the floor. The last thing Amelia saw before everything went black was the quiet cowboy's face, solemn, calm, and safe like warmth at the end of a long, frozen road. When Amelia awoke, the first thing she noticed was the warmth. Not the cold, biting air of the storm, but a deep, steady heat that wrapped around her like a blanket. The second thing was the crackling sound firewood snapping and popping softly somewhere close by. Slowly, she blinked her eyes open. She was lying on a worn leather couch in a dimly lit cabin. A quilt covered her, thick and hand-stitched, smelling faintly of cedar and smoke. Her head throbbed dully, and her lips were dry. When she tried to sit up, dizziness swept through her. "Easy," came a low, quiet voice. She turned her head and saw him, the man who had opened the door before she'd fainted. He sat in a wooden chair near the fireplace, broad-shouldered and still, a mug of coffee cradled in his hands. The flickering firelight revealed sharp cheekbones, a strong jaw dusted with stubble, and eyes that were calm yet distant, the color of winter earth. "Where?" "Am I?" she murmured. "My place," he said simply. "You passed out on the porch." "Found your car in the ditch this morning." Amelia's gaze darted around. The cabin was rustic but neat, sturdy furniture, shelves lined with old books, and a rifle mounted over the mantel. Through the window, she could see only white. The storm hadn't ended. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice cracking. "You saved my life." He shrugged, as if it were nothing. "Storm like that, you'd have frozen in an hour." She tried to smile, though her body trembled slightly. "I didn't mean to intrude. I just saw your light." "You did right," he said. There was silence again, the kind that stretched and filled the room like fog. Amelia glanced toward him, curious and uneasy. He was so still, almost unreadable, like a statue carved from stone. "I'm Amelia," she offered softly, trying to bridge the quiet. He nodded once. "Noah, just Noah. No last name, no further detail." He didn't look at her when he said it. Instead, he stood and moved to the stove, pouring steaming coffee into a chipped mug. He handed it to her, and their fingers brushed briefly. His hand was rough, calloused, but steady. The warmth of the drink spread through her chest, easing the ache in her bones. "Do you live here alone?" she asked after a moment. He nodded again. "Been that way for a while." His answers were short, not unfriendly but deliberate, as though every word was measured. Amelia studied him. There was something about his silence that wasn't awkward. It was heavy, filled with things unsaid. He had the air of a man used to being alone, a man who carried ghosts quietly. Outside, the wind howled. Inside, the fire crackled and glowed. She told him about her car, about getting lost, but not about why she was really out there, not about Matthew, or the betrayal, or the wedding dress still hanging uselessly back in Denver. Somehow, the details felt too fragile to speak aloud. Noah listened, his gaze occasionally flicking to the flames. When she trailed off, he finally said, "Storm'll pass by morning. Roads might be open in a day or two. You can stay here till then. Are you sure?" "I don't want to. Not safe out there." His tone ended the discussion. Still, there was no edge to it. Just quiet certainty. Amelia nodded, staring into the fire. She wanted to ask more, to know who he was, what had made him choose this solitude, but something about him told her not to push. Instead, she just whispered, "Thank you, Noah." He didn't reply. But when he stood and draped another blanket over her shoulders before retreating to his chair, Amelia realized words weren't his way of showing care. As the storm raged outside, two strangers sat in a fragile silence, the distance between them shrinking with every crack of the fire. She didn't know it yet, but this quiet cowboy, this man of few words, would soon change everything she thought she knew about love, loss, and finding warmth after the coldest of storms. The blizzard didn't let up for 2 whole days. Outside, the world was buried under a white silence, but inside Noah's cabin, the fire burned bright and steady. Amelia spent most of her time wrapped in the quilt, watching the snow pile higher against the window panes. She felt like she'd stepped into another world, one far removed from the chaos and heartbreak she'd fled. Every now and then, Noah moved quietly through the cabin. He chopped wood, fed the horses in the barn, checked the generator, and cooked simple meals on the old stove. He never said much, but his presence filled the space solid, calm, and oddly comforting. Amelia couldn't help but watch him. There was a rhythm to the way he worked, deliberate and precise, as though he'd built his life around order to keep something inside him from falling apart. His silence didn't feel cold, though. It felt deliberate, almost protective. By the second morning, she felt strong enough to help. When Noah came in from the barn dusted with snow, he found her in the kitchen, sleeves rolled up, trying to make pancakes from a box she'd found in the cupboard. She looked up sheepishly when he stepped in. "I figured I should do something to repay you for saving my life," she said, flipping a lopsided pancake that half stuck to the pan. He watched her for a moment. Then a faint smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. It was the first real expression she'd seen from him. "You're gonna burn that?" She laughed, startled by the sound of his voice carrying a trace of humor. "Guess you'll have to eat it anyway." Hero's tax. That morning they ate in relative quiet, but it wasn't uncomfortable. She told him bits and pieces about herself, how she worked in marketing, how she'd been engaged, how she loved city lights and coffee shops and books she never finished. She didn't mention Matthew by name, though the shadows in her eyes said enough. Noah listened without interrupting, his gaze steady but kind. When she finally said, "I thought I had everything figured out," and then it all just, she stopped, gesturing helplessly. He nodded slightly, as if he understood without needing the rest of the words. "Life's got a way of doing that," he said quietly. The storm continued to roar outside, but inside, the fire's glow seemed to build a fragile peace between them. Amelia helped him bring in firewood that afternoon, her boots sinking into the snow while he guided her to step carefully on the icy patches. Their hands brushed once when he steadied her, and though it lasted only a moment, something warm lingered in her chest afterward. That evening, the wind eased. The cabin seemed smaller now, not from the walls closing in, but from the strange closeness forming between them. Amelia sat by the fire, reading from an old novel she'd found on his shelf. Her voice filled the room softly while Noah whittled a small piece of wood at the table. When she finished reading a line about loss and love, she looked up and caught him watching her, not with intensity, but with quiet curiosity, as if he were remembering what it felt like to be part of someone's world again. Their eyes met, and for a heartbeat, neither looked away. The clock ticked softly in the background. Amelia's voice faltered. Noah set down the knife, clearing his throat. "You should rest. Roads'll open soon." She nodded, though part of her didn't want the storm to end just yet. As she lay down later, listening to the fire fade to embers, she thought about the man who spoke so little yet made her feel more understood than anyone had in years. In the heart of the snowstorm, two strangers had found shelter, not just from the cold outside, but from the storms inside them. Neither of them said it aloud, but something fragile and new was beginning to take root in the warmth of that quiet cabin. By the third morning, the storm began to loosen its grip on the valley. The snow stopped falling, and sunlight filtered weakly through the gray clouds, turning the frozen world outside into a sea of glittering white. Inside the cabin, the air felt lighter, warmer, almost alive. But the silence that had once felt peaceful now hummed with something unspoken between them. Amelia was beginning to find a rhythm there. She'd wake before Noah, boil water for coffee, and quietly feed the old cat that liked to curl near the fire. The routine steadied her, something to hold on to after weeks of chaos. She'd lost her home, her trust, and her sense of direction. But here, in this cabin in the middle of nowhere, life suddenly felt simple. Noah, however, was still a mystery. He rarely talked about himself, and when he did, his answers came in fragments, just enough to suggest the weight he carried. Amelia caught glimpses of it in his eyes when he stared out the window too long, or when his voice turned softer than usual. That afternoon, she followed him outside while he repaired a broken section of the fence. The sun was bright against the snow, and her breath came out in white clouds. She offered to help, though he looked skeptical at first. "You ever fixed a fence before?" he asked, eyebrow raised. "No," she admitted, squinting at the wooden posts. "But I'm a quick learner. Besides, I owe you more than pancakes and company." That earned a low chuckle from him, rare and quiet, but real. "All right, then. Just don't freeze your fingers off." They worked side by side for hours, the sound of hammering echoing through the crisp air. Amelia found herself stealing glances at him when she thought he wasn't looking, the easy strength in his movements, the patience in how he taught her to tie the wire correctly. She hadn't realized how long it had been since she'd felt safe near someone. When they paused for a break, she leaned against the fence post, watching the horizon. "It's beautiful here," she said softly. "Peaceful. Most folks don't like the quiet," Noah replied. "Says it makes them think too much." She smiled faintly. "Maybe that's why I like it. I've been running from my thoughts for too long." He glanced at her then, his gaze searching but gentle. "You run from something?" Her throat tightened. The cold air stung her cheeks, and for a moment she debated deflecting. But something about his steadiness drew the truth out. "A wedding," she said finally, voice trembling. "Mine. Found out the man I was going to marry wasn't who I thought he was." Noah didn't say anything right away. He set his hammer down, eyes fixed on the snow. "That kind of hurt doesn't go away easy," he said quietly. "You start doubting everything, even yourself." She turned toward him, surprised. "You sound like you know." He gave a small nod. "Lost my wife 5 years ago. Car accident. Took our baby with her." His voice cracked slightly, the words raw even after all that time. "Haven't had much to say since." The air grew still. Amelia's heart ached at the pain in his tone. She stepped closer, hesitated, then gently said, "I'm so sorry, Noah." He shrugged, but his eyes were wet. "Life doesn't stop hurting. You just learn to live around the hole it leaves." For a long moment, neither spoke. The wind whispered softly through the trees, carrying away the weight of their shared silence. In that quiet, Amelia understood him in a way words could never capture his solitude. His distance, his need for peace. "Maybe," she said softly. "The hole doesn't have to stay empty forever." Noah looked at her then. Really looked at her, and something cracked open behind those guarded eyes. A flicker of warmth. A fragile spark dot. By the time they walked back to the cabin, the light had softened into gold. The fire awaited them, and though the storm had passed, something else was just beginning to thaw two wounded hearts, finding their way toward one another, one honest moment at a time. The days that followed brought a strange calm. The blizzard had moved on, leaving behind a landscape washed in white and silence. Amelia found herself dreading the thought of the roads reopening. Each morning, she told herself she would leave once the plows came through, but every evening, she found another excuse to stay. Noah didn't ask her to go, but he didn't ask her to stay either. He was a man of quiet gestures, leaving an extra log on the fire before he went out to work, setting a second mug of coffee on the table before she woke, wordlessly handing her gloves before stepping into the cold. It was as though he had built a language without words, one she was only beginning to understand. They had started to fall into a rhythm. Amelia helped with the morning chores, feeding the horses, gathering eggs from the coop, brushing the snow from the porch railing. She laughed more now, and sometimes, when she caught Noah watching her, she saw the corner of his mouth lift into something that almost looked like a smile, but the quiet moments between them often carried a weight, to a heaviness that came from all the things left unsaid. Amelia could feel it in the way he sometimes stared at the horizon for too long, or in how he hesitated when she asked about his wife. He carried his grief like an invisible brand, one he didn't want to burden anyone else with. One evening, while the wind howled softly outside, Amelia sat at the kitchen table, sketching aimlessly on a scrap of paper. Noah sat across from her, mending a piece of broken tack. The flicker of the lantern cast warm light over his hands. "Can I ask you something?" she said finally, setting the pencil down. He didn't look up. "You can. What was she like?" "Your wife." For a long time, he said nothing. The only sound was the creak of the chair and the ticking of the clock on the wall. Amelia regretted asking. She opened her mouth to take it back, but then he spoke. "Her name was Lily," he said quietly. "She liked to sing while she cooked. Couldn't carry a tune to save her life, but she sang anyway." His lips curved faintly, though his eyes were distant. "She was the kind of person who found light in everything, even in me." Amelia's heart clenched. "You must miss her." "Every day," he admitted. "Some days it feels like she's just out feeding the chickens. Other days it feels like she's been gone forever." They sat in silence for a while after that, the fire crackling between them. Then, softly, Amelia said, "I know what it's like to lose someone you thought you'd spend your life with. It's not the same, but it hurts all the same. You start wondering if love is worth the risk again." Noah looked at her, then really looked. "Do you think it is?" She hesitated, staring at her hands. "I don't know, but I think it's worse to live without it." Something in his expression shifted, just a flicker of warmth in his eyes before he returned to his work. But Amelia saw it, and it stirred something inside her she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Later that night, she lay awake, listening to the fire fade. Her heart was no longer as heavy as it had been when she'd first arrived. She thought about Noah's quiet strength, about the way his grief lived beside his gentleness. And she wondered if maybe healing wasn't about forgetting, but about finding someone who understood your scars. Outside, the storm clouds had drifted far away. The sky was clear now, 1,000 stars glinting over the snow. Amelia pressed her hand to the window, her reflection soft in the glass. Somewhere out in the darkness, Noah was tending the horses, his lantern bobbing faintly in the distance, and though neither of them said it, both felt the same pull, that quiet, undeniable thread binding two lonely souls beneath the winter sky. The snow returned that evening not as a storm, but as a gentle whisper, falling in soft flakes that shimmered under the porch light. Amelia stood by the window, watching the quiet beauty unfold across the ranch. The world looked untouched, pure and still. For the first time since she'd arrived, she didn't feel like a runaway anymore. She felt safe. Noah was out in the barn, tending to the horses. She could see his lantern glowing faintly through the frost-covered glass, the rhythmic motion of his work steady and sure. Something about that sight stirred her heart. He had become a constant in her life without meaning to, his silence, his patience, his quiet strength. She pulled on her coat and boots and stepped outside. The air was cold enough to sting her lungs, but the snow was soft beneath her feet. The night sky stretched wide and infinite, full of stars that shimmered through the falling snow. Noah looked up when she entered the barn. The horses shifted softly in their stalls, their breath puffing out like ghosts. He set down his brush, surprise flickering in his eyes. "You should be inside. It's cold." "I wanted to help," she said, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "And maybe to say goodbye." He stiffened slightly. "You're leaving tomorrow?" She nodded, her heart sinking even as she spoke the words. "The roads are clear. I called a tow truck earlier. They'll meet me in town." Noah's expression didn't change, but something in the air between them did. The quiet that had once felt warm now felt sharp, edged with an ache neither wanted to name. She took a step closer. "These last few days, they've meant more to me than you'll ever know. You reminded me that kindness still exists, that not everyone walks away when things get hard." He didn't respond right away, just studied her with those deep, steady eyes. Then, Softly he said, "You didn't just survive the storm, Amelia. You walked straight into it and found your way out. That kind of strength, people spend their whole lives looking for it." His words struck her like a heartbeat. She felt her throat tighten, tears threatening. "I wasn't strong," she whispered. "I was broken." "Maybe," he said, his voice low. "But broken things can still be beautiful." Their eyes met hers, full of gratitude and sorrow, his full of something he couldn't quite say. For a long moment, they simply stood there, surrounded by the soft sounds of the barn, the creak of wood, the slow breath of the horses, the snow brushing against the roof. Then Amelia stepped closer, close enough to see the stubble on his jaw, the scar at his temple, the warmth in his breath. "Noah," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "I wish I could stay." He reached up, his hand brushing a stray flake of snow from her hair. The touch was feather-light, but it sent a shiver through her, not from the cold, but from the tenderness behind it. For a moment, neither moved. Then, as if pulled by the same invisible thread, they leaned in. The kiss was slow, hesitant at first, then deepened with the kind of longing that only comes from people who've forgotten what it's like to be held. The world outside disappeared, the pain, the distance, the past. There was only warmth, the steady beat of two hearts thawing beneath falling snowdot. When they finally pulled apart, Amelia's eyes glistened. Noah rested his forehead against hers, breathing her in like she was the first breath of spring after a long winter. "You should get inside," he murmured. His voice rough. She nodded, but neither of them moved. The snow kept falling, soft and endless, wrapping them in its silence. That night, back inside the cabin, Amelia couldn't sleep. She sat by the fire, fingertips touching her lips where his warmth still lingered. The kiss hadn't been a promise, just a truth. A truth that love could find you again, even after loss. Outside, Noah stood on the porch, watching the snow drift against the fences. He didn't believe in miracles anymore, but the woman who had stumbled into his life like a storm had reminded him what it felt like to hope. And somewhere in that quiet Wyoming night, two lonely souls finally began to thaw. Morning came quietly, wrapped in a pale gold light that spilled through the cabin windows. The storm had passed completely, leaving behind a glittering world of snow that looked almost too perfect to touch. Amelia sat at the edge of the bed, her suitcase packed and resting beside her boots. The fire had burned low, but its last embers still pulsed with a gentle warmth, like the fading echo of something beautiful. She should have felt relief. The roads were clear, her car was being towed to town, and she finally had a way home. But instead, her chest felt heavy, as if she were leaving something far more important behind than she'd found when she'd arrived. Downstairs, she heard the familiar rhythm of Noah moving through his morning routine, the scrape of a chair, the clink of a mug, the soft thud of boots on the wooden floor. He hadn't said much since last night. After their kiss, they'd shared a silence that wasn't uncomfortable, but fragile, like both of them were afraid that words might shatter it. When she came down the stairs, he was standing by the window, coffee in hand, watching the sunlight stretch across the snow-covered fields. He turned when he heard her, his expression unreadable. "You're all set?" he asked. His voice was even calm. Too calm. Amelia nodded, trying to keep her voice steady. "The tow truck should be here in half an hour." "Good," he said softly, setting his mug on the table. "They'll get you into town before noon." She hesitated. The air between them felt thick with everything unsaid, the memories they built in just a few short days, the pain they'd both confessed, and the quiet hope that had begun to bloom between them. "I wanted to thank you," she said finally, "for saving me, for letting me stay." He gave a small shrug, eyes drifting back to the window. "Didn't do much. You'd done the same." "That's not true," she whispered. "You did more than you know." Her throat tightened as she watched him. He looked every bit the man he was, strong, steady, rooted in the earth like the mountains behind him. And yet, beneath that quiet strength, she could feel the same ache that lived inside her. "You could stay." "You know," he said suddenly, his voice low, almost cautious. "Winter's long here. Could use another hand around the ranch." Amelia's heart stumbled. It wasn't exactly a plea, but it wasn't casual either. It was the kind of offer that carried weight, the kind that could change everything. She smiled faintly, though her eyes shimmered. "If I stayed, I might never find the courage to leave again." Noah's jaw tightened slightly. Maybe that wouldn't be such a bad thing. They stood in silence, the air humming with all the words they couldn't say. She wanted to tell him that she was scared, that she'd only just started finding herself again, and that staying might mean losing control of that fragile new strength. But she also wanted to tell him that being near him felt like breathing again. The rumble of an engine broke the silence. The tow truck had arrived. Noah stepped forward, taking her bag without asking and carrying it to the porch. She followed, every step heavier than the last. The sunlight caught the snow, turning it into shards of light. At the truck, she turned to him. "I'll never forget this place," she said softly. "Or you." He nodded once, his eyes unreadable, but the muscle in his jaw flexed. "Take care of yourself, Amelia." She smiled through tears. "You too, Cowboy." And then, before she could stop herself, she rose on her toes and pressed a kiss to his cheek. It was brief, soft, but it lingered like a promise neither dared to make. When she climbed into the truck, she looked back one last time. Noah stood in the snow, one hand resting on his hat, his breath misting in the cold air. The distance grew between them, the cabin shrinking into the horizon. But the ache in her chest only deepened. For the first time since the storm, Amelia cried not out of heartbreak, but because she had finally found something worth missing. The cabin felt different after she left. The silence, once peaceful, now echoed in the hollows of Noah's chest like a sound he couldn't turn off. Every creak of the wood, every soft hiss from the fire reminded him of her, of the way she hummed while she cooked. The light sound of her laughter, the warmth she carried wherever she went. For years, Noah had lived alone without feeling lonely. Solitude had been his shelter, his shield. But now, after Amelia, it felt like a punishment. He moved through the cabin as if through memory, his hand brushing the back of the chair where she'd sat sketching, his gaze pausing on the empty cup she'd favored, still sitting beside the sink. She'd left a scarf behind, a soft blue one, hanging on the peg by the door. He told himself he'd mail it back. But every time he reached for it, he stopped, fingers curling in the air. Outside, winter still held the land in its grip. The days were cold and sharp, the nights long. Noah worked harder than ever, trying to fill the hours with the rhythm of ranch life. He repaired fences, shoveled snow, fed the horses, mended roofs, anything to drown out the silence that waited for him each night. But the thing about silence, he realized, is that it never really goes away. It waits. At night, when the world turned dark and still, he found himself drawn to the fire again. He'd sit in his old chair, staring into the flames, replaying fragments of her voice. He could still see her there wrapped in his old quilt, eyes bright with curiosity, asking about the constellations. "You don't talk much," she had teased once. "But when you do, it's like the world stops to listen." He smiled at the memory, though it ached. She'd brought warmth back into a place that had long forgotten it. One evening, a storm rolled in from the north, nothing like the blizzard from before, but enough to make the wind rattle the windows. As he stoked the fire, his gaze fell on the small notebook she'd left on the side table. She'd been sketching in it the day before she left, and though he'd promised himself not to pry, curiosity got the better of him. When he opened it, his breath caught. Inside were pencil sketches rough but full of life. The cabin, the barn, the horses, him. She'd drawn him without his knowing, bent over his work, face half hidden by his hat, but unmistakably him. On the last page, she'd written in looping, careful handwriting, sometimes. You don't have to say much for someone to hear you. Noah closed the notebook gently and set it down. His throat felt tight, his vision blurring from the heat of the fire, or maybe from something else entirely. For the first time in years, he let himself feel the full weight of his loneliness, and how deeply she had reached him. Days turned to weeks. The snow began to melt, and the first hints of spring softened the air. The mountains that had stood silent all winter began to hum with life again, melting streams, distant birdsong. Noah went about his chores as usual, but his heart wasn't the same. Every sunrise reminded him of her, the woman who had stumbled into his life like a storm and left behind sunlight. One afternoon, as he brushed down one of the horses, his neighbor Hank stopped by, leaning on the fence. "Heard you had company during the blizzard," he said with a grin. Figured the quiet old carter finally found himself some company. Noah only nodded, a small smile tugging at his mouth. "Something like that," he said softly. When Hank rode off, Noah stood there for a long time, staring across the open land. The wind carried the faint scent of thawing earth, and for the first time in years, it didn't feel empty. Maybe she was gone, but she hadn't really left. Amelia had changed something in him, something permanent. The silence that had once been his refuge was now a reminder of laughter, of second chances, of a woman with eyes full of light who had walked into his life and shown him how to live again. And though the cabin stood quiet, it no longer felt lonely. It felt like it was waiting just as he was. Spring had arrived in full bloom when Amelia found herself driving back along the long, winding road that led toward the Carter Ranch. The snow had melted into glistening streams, the meadows spread wide with wildflowers, and the mountains stood green and alive. Yet, beneath all that beauty, Amelia's heart thudded with nervous anticipation. It had been nearly 3 months since she'd left. In that time, she'd tried to rebuild her life, to return to the world she had before the storm. Her apartment in the city felt smaller than ever. The silence that had once been a comfort now echoed like a hollow space where something essential was missing. She went back to teaching, tried reconnecting with friends, but every quiet moment pulled her back to that cabin. To Noah. She had written him once a short letter she never sent. Every time she tried to mail it, she'd stop at the door, uncertain. What if he had moved on? What if what she had felt had been nothing more than a moment born from isolation and gratitude? Still, she couldn't shake the ache that told her it was real. So when the school year ended, and she found herself restless one sleepless night, she packed her car again. No plan, no promises. Just a direction north, toward the mountains, toward him. The dirt road came into view just as the sun began to dip behind the peaks. Her hands tightened on the steering wheel as she recognized the familiar landmarks, the fence line, the crooked pine tree by the bend, the glimmer of the creek. And then, there it was, the cabin. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney. The sight hit her like a wave. It was exactly the same, and yet everything inside her had changed. She parked the car and stepped out slowly. The air was cool and smelled of pine and fresh rain. Her boots crunched over the damp earth as she walked toward the porch. She paused at the bottom step, nerves fluttering like wild birds in her chest. The door opened before she could knock. Noah stood there, hat in hand, his expression unreadable for a moment. But then his eyes softened, the quiet blue she remembered so well, full of surprise and something deeper, something he didn't dare to name yet. "Amelia," he said, her name falling from his lips like a prayer. She smiled, her throat tight. "Hi, Noah." For a long heartbeat, they simply looked at each other. The last time she had seen him, snow had been falling. Now sunlight poured between them, I didn't mean to just show up, she began, her voice trembling slightly. I was passing through, and I thought You weren't passing through. He interrupted gently, his gaze steady. You came back. Her lips parted, but no words came. He was right. She wasn't here by accident. He stepped aside, motioning for her to come in. The cabin smelled just as she remembered: wood smoke, coffee, and something warm she couldn't quite name. Her eyes darted to the small details: the new curtains, the vase of wildflowers on the table, the blue scarf still hanging by the door. You kept it, she murmured. He nodded. Figured you might come for it someday. They stood in silence for a moment. Then, softly, she said, I missed this place. I missed. She hesitated, eyes meeting his. You? Something in him shifted, then a crack in the quiet armor he built around his heart. He took a slow step forward, close enough that she could see the flicker of emotion in his eyes. I missed you too, he said, voice low and rough. Didn't realize how much till you were gone. She smiled, tears stinging her eyes. So, what happens now? He studied her for a long moment before replying. Guess that depends on whether you're staying this time. Amelia's heart steadied, the weight of all her fears and doubts dissolving under the warmth of his gaze. She took his hand, fingers fitting perfectly between his. I think I've been trying to find my way back here since the day I left. Outside, the last light of day faded into gold, wrapping the cabin in a quiet glow. Inside, for the first time, there was no loneliness, only the gentle hum of something beginning again. Morning sunlight spilled softly through the cabin windows, catching in the curls of steam that rose from the mugs on the table. The world outside was green again, alive with the hum of bees and the rush of the river breaking free from its icy hold. The air was warm, touched with the scent of pine and wildflowers. And inside the cabin, something new had taken root. Peace. Amelia stood by the window, her hair loose around her shoulders, watching the horses grazing in the meadow. It still felt like a dream sometimes to wake here, surrounded by the quiet rhythm of the land, with Noah's presence steady and grounding beside her. The restlessness that had haunted her for so long was gone, replaced by something she hadn't felt in years: belonging. Behind her, Noah poured another cup of coffee, his movements easy and unhurried. He'd changed too, though not in obvious ways. The lines on his face were softer now, his eyes less shadowed. He still didn't say much, but his silences had shifted. They weren't walls anymore, but a kind of gentle space between words where she always felt safe. You're up early, he said, voice rough with sleep. Couldn't help it, she replied with a small smile, turning to face him. The sunrise out here is impossible to ignore. He crossed the room and handed her a mug, his fingers brushing hers. The simple touch sent warmth through her, familiar yet still thrilling. You'll get used to it, he said, though the faint smile on his lips said he hoped she wouldn't. She took a sip of coffee and leaned against the counter. You really think I'm staying, huh? Noah's gaze met hers, steady and quiet. I don't think, he said simply. I know. Amelia laughed softly, shaking her head. You're awfully sure of yourself, Cowboy. He shrugged. Guess I just finally know when something feels right. Those words landed deep inside her, melting the last remnants of doubt. For months after leaving the ranch, she'd struggled to make sense of her feelings, had questioned if what they'd shared had been real, or just the product of two lonely souls finding each other in a storm. But standing here now, hearing his calm certainty, she knew. It had been real from the start. Later that morning, they went outside together. The day was bright and full of promise. Noah showed her how to saddle a horse properly, laughing when she fumbled with the straps. She teased him back, calling him the quiet cowboy with too many rules. It was easy. This closeness between them, like they'd both known all along that they'd find their way back to a dot at noon. They rode out toward the ridge, where the land stretched wide and endless. From up there, Amelia could see everything: the valley below, the glint of the river, the cabin tucked between the trees. It was beautiful, but what struck her most wasn't the view, it was the stillness inside her. For the first time in years, she wasn't running from anything. "This place suits you," Noah said, watching her instead of the landscape. She turned to him, smiling. "It's not just the place." He reached out, taking her hand, their fingers fitting together with the ease of something long meant to be. The wind brushed past them, carrying the scent of earth and grass and sunlight. "You sure you're ready for this life?" he asked quietly. "It ain't easy. Some days it's hard as hell." She looked at him, her eyes shining. "I've already survived worse. And I think I was meant to find this. To find you." For a moment neither spoke. The world seemed to still around them. Then Noah leaned forward, his forehead resting gently against hers. "Guess we both found what we were looking for," he murmured Dot as the sun climbed higher. They sat together on the ridge, the land stretching endlessly before them, a place where the past no longer held power and the future felt wide open. The storm that had brought them together was long gone, but its memory lingered. A reminder that sometimes the fiercest tempests lead us exactly where we're meant to be. And there, in the warmth of a new morning, the quiet cowboy and the woman who'd once been heartbroken and lost began their next chapter, not as two people searching, but as two souls finally home,